In the summer of 1917, two young English cousins, 16-year-old Elsie Wright and 9-year-old Frances Griffiths, borrowed a camera and took a photograph beside a stream near their home in the small Yorkshire village of Cottingley, showing Frances seated calmly beside what looked like four tiny winged fairies dancing in mid-air. The fairies were paper cutouts, copied from illustrations in an old storybook, carefully colored in and propped upright in the grass with ordinary hatpins. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the celebrated author who created Sherlock Holmes, fiction's most famous rational detective, saw the photographs years later and became personally, publicly convinced they were genuine evidence of supernatural creatures. That isn't an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The man behind literature's greatest skeptic spent years defending a set of blurry photographs of paper cutouts as real, undeniable proof that fairies existed. He wrote an entire book making the case, and it would take the two cousins responsible more than 60 years to finally admit what almost anyone examining the photographs closely might have suspected from the very beginning. Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths were cousins growing up in Cottingley, a quiet village near Bradford in the north of England. Frances and her mother had recently moved back to England from South Africa, and the two girls, close in the way only childhood cousins can be, spent much of that summer playing together along Cottingley Beck, a small stream running behind the Wright family's garden. Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, was an early amateur photography enthusiast with his own darkroom, and Elsie had grown up around cameras and developing chemicals. When the girls came home one day insisting they had been playing with fairies by the beck and their parents scoffed, the girls borrowed Arthur's camera to prove it, and came back with a photograph appearing to show exactly that. Arthur Wright, developing the photograph himself, immediately suspected some kind of trick and dismissed the whole thing as a children's prank not worth taking seriously. His wife, Polly Wright, felt differently. Polly had become interested in theosophy, a spiritual movement popular in early 20th century Britain that took a serious open interest in fairies, spirits, and unseen dimensions of nature, a worldview that found the photographs not just amusing, but genuinely plausible. In 1919, Polly brought the photographs to a Theosophical Society meeting in Bradford. From there, they began traveling far beyond anything the two girls could have anticipated. The photographs eventually reached Edward Gardner, a prominent member of the Theosophical Society, who was struck enough by them to have the negatives professionally examined by photography experts. The experts could find no evidence of double exposure or obvious darkroom trickery, a conclusion that, at the time, was widely misread as proof the photographs were genuine rather than evidence that the fairies were simply physical objects placed in front of the camera, exactly as they actually were. Around this time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had been commissioned to write an article on fairies for the Christmas 1920 issue of the Strand magazine, the same publication that had made Sherlock Holmes famous. Doyle, who had grown deeply interested in spiritualism in the aftermath of the First World War and the death of his own son, was shown the Cottingley photographs by Gardner and became immediately enthusiastic, seeing in them exactly the kind of evidence he'd been searching for. At Doyle's urging, Elsie and Frances took 3 additional fairy photographs in August 1920, adding to the original 2. Doyle published the photographs alongside his article, presenting them to the public as compelling evidence that fairies were real. The response was massive. Some readers were charmed, others outraged that a man of Doyle's stature would endorse what looked, to plenty of ordinary observers, exactly like paper cutouts. Doyle didn't back down. In 1922, he expanded the article into an entire book, The Coming of the Fairies, doubling down on his belief in what 2 schoolgirls had made with scissors and hatpins. The Coming of the Fairies turned 2 amateur photographs from a Yorkshire garden into a national controversy. Newspapers debated whether the fairies were real, professional photographers and scientists picked the images apart publicly, and Elsie and Frances, young women by then, though still a teenager and a schoolgirl when it first happened, found themselves quietly famous for something they knew, privately, was completely fake. Skeptics raised exactly the objections that would eventually prove correct. The fairies in the photographs looked suspiciously two-dimensional. Their poses matched illustrations from a well-known 1915 children's storybook almost exactly, and one photograph showed a fairy with a distinctly 1920s hairstyle, an odd detail for a supposedly ancient magical creature. Conan Doyle, committed publicly to his belief and unwilling to consider that two young girls could have fooled him, dismissed each objection in turn, arguing that skeptics simply lacked the open-mindedness to accept evidence outside ordinary experience. Elsie and Frances, remarkably, never fully confessed during Doyle's lifetime. Frances later said the two of them found it almost impossible to correct a man as famous and as certain as Conan Doyle once he had committed himself so publicly. As she put it decades later, it felt like two village children calling out one of the most respected writers in England. So they let the mystery continue, sometimes hinting at doubts, but never directly admitting the photographs were staged, for year after year after year. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle died in 1930, having never abandoned his belief in the Cottingley Fairies. Elsie and Frances lived on for decades afterward, occasionally interviewed, always evasive, letting the mystery linger even as skepticism became the dominant public view. It wasn't until 1983, 66 years after the first photograph was taken, that Elsie Wright finally admitted the full truth in an interview with the magazine The Unexplained. The fairies, she confirmed, were paper cutouts copied directly from illustrations in a 1915 children's book, carefully colored with paints and crayons, cut out and held in place in the grass using ordinary hatpins. After each photograph was taken, the girls simply removed the pins and cutouts and went home. Elsie explained that she and Frances had been too embarrassed, and too aware of how much they had embarrassed Conan Doyle, to admit the truth while he was alive. As she put it, two village kids and a brilliant man like Conan Doyle, well, we could only keep quiet. There was one lingering wrinkle even after the confession. Frances Griffiths, until her own death in 1986, maintained that while the first 4 photographs were entirely staged, the 5th and final photograph, a hazy image of fairies in a nest of grass, showed something she genuinely couldn't fully explain. Most historians treat this claim skeptically, as a small holdout from a woman who had spent her entire life inside a lie she never asked to tell. The Cottingley Fairies hoax stands today as one of the most famous and most oddly gentle deceptions in modern history. No one profited from it, no one set out to build a movement, and the girls responsible spent most of their lives quietly wishing the whole thing would just go away. Instead, it grew into a genuine cultural phenomenon, endorsed by one of the most famous writers alive, and it took over 6 decades for the truth to catch up with the legend. The original photographs and cameras used are now held by the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, England, preserved as artifacts of one of the 20th century's strangest lessons in how badly even brilliant, rational minds want to believe in something magical. Arthur Conan Doyle spent his career writing a detective who solved cases by refusing to accept anything without hard evidence, and spent his final years defending photographs that 2 schoolgirls had made with scissors, paint, and hatpins from a garden. The fairies of Cottingley were never real. But the story of 2 girls who fooled the creator of Sherlock Holmes and then had to live with that secret for the rest of their lives turned out to be strange enough on its own. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.